I'm Dolen Perkins-Valdez, and I'm a historical fiction writer. When I'm not writing, I'm teaching. When I'm not teaching, I'm playing with my kids. But the place I love to be the most is in the library. I love to read historical fiction. It just transports me. So I decided to start this book club. Here together, we will read stories featuring women's histories. We'll talk to writers, we'll have discussions. It'll be fun. Come on and join us. Hi.
Hello.
Welcome. I'm so excited. Y'all, tonight, we're talking about this book right here, Masquerade, which you must own for the cover alone. Look at that artwork they did, y'all. Look at that. Look at that. Front, beautiful author photo. Back, this map is just gorgeous. And I'm going to just put this book close up so you can see the gold foil, the beautiful image with the elephant, the woman. What a pleasure to welcome you tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you.
So, y'all, I know everybody is wondering how to address this blazing new talent who is going to take over the world. I said before, tonight, I told my book club, I said, y'all have to come to this because in 2 years, we won't even be able to book her. She's going to be so famous. But what everybody wants to know is what to call you. I know, but I want my book club members to know, and how to pronounce your name.
Sure. You can just call me Oyin. That's my name. And my last name is Sangoyomi, SH sound. So Oyin Sangoyomi.
Oyin, Oyin, Sangoyomi.
Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful. So let's dive right in, Oyin. So, okay. You just graduated from Princeton, is that right?
Last year, yeah.
Year, okay. And you wrote this while you were a student at Princeton?
I did during my sophomore year.
During your sophomore year. And you were an English major? What was your major?
I was English major, but like officially, but I barely took any classes in my department, honestly. I mostly took history, African American studies, and comparative literature classes. But on paper, my degree reads English.
Okay. But you had some latitude to sort of take different classes that interested you.
Definitely. That was the freedom of the English major. There was not as many requirements, which allowed you to kind of spread out more.
Mm-hmm. And you got tell me how you thought about this being something. Was it a class that you were taking that was inspiring you, or what made you write this story?
So I've always been a writer since I was really young. And so whenever I've, run into interesting tidbits of information, my first instinct has always been how I can make this into a story. And it was like after my freshman year of college that summer, I started reading more about pre-colonial West Africa and just that history because I'd always wanted to learn about it. And the more that I read about it, the more that I wanted to write a story set in this setting.
Mm-hmm. And your family is from Nigeria?
Yeah, my parents immigrated from there.
And so did you take a class at Princeton that sort of gave you some of that pre-colonial history, or was there a professor there who you worked with, or was this something you were doing on the side?
It was something I was doing on the side. And actually, that's the reason why I wrote it, because I did look for African history classes. And there is an African Studies department at Princeton, but it's very small and it's honestly kind of dying a little bit. And so there were no classes related to what I specifically wanted to learn. And so that's when I kind of started using Princeton's library and looking up books and documents and whatever I could really get my hands on to just kind of learn it on my own.
So this is a story, y'all. And I mean, I'm sorry if y'all haven't finished it. We're going to try not to do too much on the plot spoilers, but it's very hard because I know that the people who read it want to talk about it. But this is a story about a young woman who is a blacksmith. And at this time, and I'm real curious, Oyin, about how much of this is imagined and how much of it is historical, but at that time, blacksmiths were considered witches or something
Hmm.
akin to witches, right? And she rises from there. She's kidnapped by the Alafin. Is that how you pronounce it? The Alafin?
Laughing.
Alafin.
The thing about Yoruba words is that it's really every syllable is pronounced in them usually.
Every syllable. And that's something I want to make sure we get some pronunciations here tonight. Because when I tell people about the book, I want to know what, sound like I know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this book to everybody I know. So she's kidnapped by the Ala'afin and ends up in the royal city
Mm.
where she must survive. And at every point, she is using her, she's super smart. And we get that from the very first chapter, how smart she is. And at every moment, in order for her to survive, and not just survive, to thrive, she's got to use her intellect. So tell us about her. Is it Ododo?
Yeah, a dodo.
Yeah, tell us
Yeah.
about how you came up with her as a character.
Yeah, I honestly, for a while before I wrote this, I was really interested in the kind of phenomenon of the strong female protagonist that kind of came to popularity in like the 2010s. And personally, I think that that character fails in a lot of ways, that it tries to be the opposite of a Mary Sue character, but I feel like she's very similar to Mary Sue. It's just now she has a sword. She's still very perfect, and she still kind of fights for not really herself, but just to save everyone else. And I really wanted to write a female character that was flawed and was selfish and was basically human. And so with the dodo, I wanted to write someone who made mistakes and who did learn from those mistakes, but maybe, went in the wrong direction from it. And I wanted to have a character that was pushed to her limits and, see what she would choose, and someone who learned the different types of strengths that there were for women.
Aren't those the best kind of characters? The ones who are flawed and she's so young. Of course she's going to make mistakes, right? Because how
Exactly.
old is she when she's kidnapped?
She's 19. And keep in mind, she's like very sheltered for her whole life. So she doesn't even, have any of that outside experience too. She learns on the go, basically.
Mhm, mhm. And so, did you take any creative writing classes, or how did you uh, think about the structure of this novel? I'm so curious because you're like a phenom, okay, Oyin, and we want to know everything.
I didn't take any creative writing classes prior to writing it. After I wrote it, that's when I started taking creative writing classes. But I really do think that my best education for learning how to write was just writing. Like before this book, I've been writing a lot of books for like many years. And that kind of taught me, how to write a character and how to structure a story and what works and what doesn't.
Mhm.
And so it was really just through practice, I think, that I got to this point to be able to write this book.
That's so interesting because, sometimes I had heard the writer Charles Johnson talk about the Apprentice novel. Years ago, I heard him say that he wrote 7 Apprentice novels before he published his first novel. And I
Mhm.
remember hearing that and thought, oh, so that's what I was doing when I was writing all those manuscripts that ended up in my drawer. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah,
so you're doing that. You did that kind of apprenticing, right? Like through just writing stuff maybe that wasn't published, right? Is that?
definitely. Yeah, and people, they always ask me, like, if I'll ever come back to that stuff that I wrote and, that no one will see, because I think they think that, it's a shame that it doesn't get
Yeah.
published or anything, but I don't. I don't think it was a waste of time at all, because I learned so much with every single story I wrote. It doesn't matter if no one else sees it. I am using it for future stories that people will then see.
Mhm, mhm. Be careful because your family will publish it. They'll be like, I remember, like when they published Ralph Ellison's Juneteenth, I was like, ah, writer's nightmare. So tell me about, okay, so you published this novel with Tor
Yeah.
book. And Tor is known, y'all, for publishing fantasy, speculative fiction. I am a historical fiction reader and write. I mean, I read everything, honestly. But I read this book with sort of no expectations.
Mhm.
But are people expecting it to be more speculative or fantasy because of the publisher and because of the cover, etc.?
I think so. I think on one hand, it does have to do with the publisher, but the thing about Tor, right, is that it's a publishing group and an imprint. And I think that most people, when they see Tor, they automatically assume that science fiction fantasy imprint. But my imprint is Forge, and then that's under the Tor umbrella. And Forge is like historical fiction, mystery, thriller. But definitely when they see the Tor name, that probably invokes some type of, fantasy expectations. But I also think just in terms of like the cover influencing things, from the moment this book was announced, it was like misinterpreted as fantasy, even before there was a cover, before there were any images. So I think on one level, it is like people do expect this type of story itself to be speculative fiction, removed from any of the elements around it.
Yeah, and I'm curious about that because when people think about, for example, the Orishas, like
Mm.
there is, a scene here where Ododo encounters them.
Mhm.
Um, in a sort of, I guess, like a Western mind, one might think of that as speculative. But in your mind, what is that?
I think, you know, it's It's really limiting to look at other cultures from a Western perspective, and I think looking at Yoruba culture through Western perspective is a great example of that because the thing about Yoruba culture is that it's so the mysticism is so really ingrained in like everyday life, and when you look at Yoruba history, you can't talk about it without also talking about Yoruba religion and the Orishas and vice versa, because with a lot of Orisha, they were real people and they were like Shango, he actually was a real king. And then it's after his death that he became an Orisha. So it's not as much of a dichotomy with Yoruba culture. But of course, with having mostly Western readers, they're very used to black and white. This is real and this is not. But Yoruba culture doesn't really follow that same framework.
Mm. Yeah, I was feeling that as I was reading the book. I mean, I didn't read any interviews with you or anything like that, but I was really understanding. I felt like how it could be misinterpreted, right?
Mhm. Yeah, and I think another thing of that, though, is also just, the Orishas in popular culture have really become kind of magical beings to the point where I think people forget it's a part of a real religion, so that's also, you
Mhm,
know, kind of blinding them from this type of book too.
mhm, mhm. This artwork on the cover, though, is just, I think, one of the prettiest covers I've ever seen. What did you think when you first saw it?
I love it. It's perfect. They sent me the sketch and then they were like, "Do you have any notes?" And I was like, "No. This is great. This is everything." Like it really I feel like it encompasses the book perfectly and all the themes in it too.
Mhm, mhm. And it's so interesting because a lot of people who outside the publishing world don't know that like it costs money for them to commission original art. And a lot of times for a debut novelist, they just won't do it. They'll just recycle something from something else. And
Mhm.
so the fact that, I mean, the paper quality and the commissioned map on the inside, um, is just lovely investment by the publisher in you. And I'm so happy. That makes me so happy that they did
Thank
that. 'Cause I
you.
know that like they don't do that for everybody.
Yeah, yeah. No, I've had a really good experience with my publisher and my team. They've all been very excited about the book. I feel like it's been a very great first experience.
Mhm, mhm. Okay, let's just see if anybody has any questions. I'm gonna be starting to ask questions. We only have until about 8:35. And so I'm welcoming you to put your questions in the chat, whether you are on Instagram or YouTube or Facebook, our Facebook group. Anybody who has a question for Oyin, we've got people here from Pennsylvania, Indianapolis, Birmingham, Alabama. I see some folks checking in from various places. So put those questions in the chat. I'm gonna continue talking with her, and then I'll ask her your questions. So in the book, the Alaafi has two wives, and so when she gets to the court, she meets Kolo, I think is the other wife's name. And she's from a tribe of sort of like warrior. Well, I guess there are warrior women, right?
Yeah.
In her tribe. How did you think about like the politics of sort of empire and what it meant for the Alaafi? Because that's, to me, equally as important in the storyline as Adodo's rise in the royal court. But what's equally important is what's happening politically and how, whether one decides to expand versus, just consolidating the people under the command, and then the blacksmiths basically walk away from the forges in a sort of strike type of move. How did you think about the politics of, I guess, for lack of a better word, empire in this pre-colonial moment?
Yeah. It was really important for me to dig into the kind of political machinations of this book as much as possible because, again, going back to that strong female protagonist, so often we've seen female characters coming into their power physically and in battle and fighting people. But, this book, I think, focuses more on how women can use their minds to get ahead and playing that game in that field. And I also think that it's a really interesting comparison to how the men in this book approach the politics of it versus the woman, because we see with the Alaafi, and he's kind of just expanding the empire because he can, basically, using brute force and just wanting that power. But people like women like Adodo, they're more strategic about it, and they have, an actual reason for doing the things that they do, and they have to be more careful about it.
Yes. And I love that, I mentioned the second wife, Kolo, the first wife, I guess, technically. I love how their conflict with each other was not an issue of like jealousy or a fight over his affections, like you nixed that from the beginning, that there was no, fight over his affection, that it was actually about political intrigue because they were both engaged, in their own ways. And I love that it wasn't sort of typically what you think about when you think about women at court together.
Yeah, no, I knew going into that I didn't want to do that at all. It's boring. And I think it's very reductive to the characters. There's just so much more at stake than, does he love me? Does he not? I wanted to show that these types of marriages, they're more than just love. They're actually life or death for these women. And that's really the angle that they're coming at it from.
Yes, I remember when one of the generals who she fought, when he was killed, and she sees like his widow's mourning, and she realizes that means sort of devastation for them.
Yeah. Without any man to attach themselves to, they're basically no one, and they have to either go find a new man to host them, basically, or they'll be at the bottom of society, even though they were once very, attached to a very powerful man and lived lives of luxury that can all go away in a moment.
Yeah. Okay, I see some questions popping up here. Were there any scenes that were particularly hard for you to write or emotionally draining?
I think in terms of hard, the beginning is usually pretty hard for me, the first chapter. It's just, you have so many ideas for what you want this story to be. And it's always hard to figure out how to enter the book and what information the reader needs to know first and how to gradually get that to them. So the beginnings are usually the hardest part for me.
Yeah. I think the hardest scene for me to read, without sort of being a major spoiler here, is when he asked her to kill her mother. Like that was a really difficult scene to read.
In general, too, emotionally, it's like, following along a dodo, I did feel really bad writing what she goes through, but that's also how I know that I'm doing it right. Like, this is
Yes.
what it's meant to be.
If it's not hard, it's,
Yeah, if I don't feel it, the reader won't.
yeah, right. Someone on Instagram wants to know, if you could speak to the link with Persephone, Hades. Did you want to speak to that?
Yeah. So I've always loved Greek mythology, and Persephone has always been one of my favorite myths. And but with that myth, I was always more focused on her kind of rise to being the queen of the underworld. But in popular culture, it's been really interpreted as a romance story and her, love with Hades. So I always wanted to write a story that focused more on her and more on her rise to power. And so this novel, it's not really, I wouldn't say a retelling. It's more like it's inspired by that myth, plot wise, in Adodo's rise to who she becomes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Someone wants to know if all of the blacksmiths were women back then.
They were not. That was actually something that I changed. This is an alternate history novel, so it doesn't completely adhere to real history. Blacksmiths, they were looked at as mystical beings of power, but they were men in history. And because they were men, I feel they had a much more positive connotation. They were called wizards rather than witches, which is, much more positive thing and much more respected thing. So I wanted to see was now one occupied by women, how would they be treated? And I think that it wouldn't be as well received. It'd be kind of like a witch hunt thing because women are not supposed to have this type of power.
Mm-hmm. What were the other sort of significant things that you changed?
I think the biggest thing is the society, Shangote, which is the capital of the empire in this book. That one is an imagined city. I took the Oyo Empire, which that one was real, and I kind of imagined what if that had broken up and then the second part had become a successful warrior society. So that's what we see in this book.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And of course, someone wants to know if Ododo was a real person. I don't think so, right?
No, she was not.
Someone wants to know, it says, you have so many lyrical sentences, like Aremo pulled the silence apart. Did these sentences come to you later after your first drafts, or did you write them immediately? Regardless, I love so many of your sentences.
Thank you. It was a mix of both. I've written poetry in the past, and what I really love about poetry is that every single word matters and every single space and punctuation matters. So I kind of always apply that to my prose, and I kind of think, what do I want these words to feel like rather than what they actually are, and how do I get that image to shape these words into that image?
There was that recurring line about his hair coming from behind his ear.
Mm-hmm.
Did you mean something with that? Was that a motif that was supposed to signify something larger?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it speaks to their relationship and their dynamic, kind of. He never noticed that hair, and that was like the first thing that she noticed. And I think that speaks to, he's so focused on like the broader picture, and the most powerful people are always the ones that are strongest or biggest, the most obvious things. But Adodo, she earns her power by not overlooking the small things, not overlooking the lives of women and the lives of children. She pays attention to every single detail. And that's really how she overcomes her situation.
Rotimi's second in command, who gets captured. I got
Mm-hmm.
the name right. I did wonder, was that his lover?
It was, yes.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
At the time,
the details. I think she sort of surmised that.
yeah. It's like an open secret, you know. It's something that can't be said explicitly at this time,
Yeah.
but no one's going to do anything about it because he's a powerful man, so he can kind of do what he wants.
Yeah. Someone wants to know what made blacksmithing mystical in the real history. I think it's like anything that has to do with altering metal, right?
Yeah. That was seen as something that was incredible, mostly because the general public didn't even know how it worked.
Right.
Blacksmiths were very private about that process. And so when they didn't know the specifics that went into it, they just assumed that it was magic.
It's like a type of alchemy, right?
Yeah, basically. And since Ogun, he's actually an Orisha that's considered to be the first blacksmith. It's believed that he kind of like supervises all blacksmiths and they have that divine connection to him as well.
Ah, I didn't know that. Okay. Okay, let's see here. Let's see. I think there was a question over here. Somebody wants to know, what would you recommend to read next for historical African lit fiction, or I guess fiction or nonfiction? They want to know.
I think it would be nice to read some writers that were born on the continent. I know that some books that influence Masquerade. There's Woman at Point Zero by, I can't pronounce her name, Nawal Al. Well, she's an Egyptian writer, but you can look up her book, Woman at Point Zero. I also love So Long a Letter by Marima Ba. I think she's from Senegal. Yeah, I really love those types of stories because I feel like they really reflect Dodo's journey, the characters in those books. And it's so interesting because it's from different time periods, but it's still all really the same story across these different women.
Okay, someone as a comment said, I love the Orisha elements. I've studied Ifa a bit and loved seeing them woven into the story. I have two sort of opposing comment questions, which I think is interesting. One person says, was there something specific that made you decide on the ending? I loved it, but it shocked me. And then the second person said, I saw the ending coming a mile away. Did you plan it from the outset, or did it naturally evolve as you were writing? So two opposing experiences on that ending.
The ending was actually the very first scene that I came up with. And so writing Masquerade, it was actually just a matter of working backwards to see what would lead to that moment. But I always knew that it was going to end like that because, you know, I wanted her to come into true power. And I think that means that she has to ultimately be free of anything tying her down, to speak about it without saying spoilers.
Well, it's interesting because like I sort of knew where we were going, but I still had to know how it was going to get there, and that to me, you know, is the beauty of any novel. I don't need to be like shocked because it, you know, what did Flannery O'Connor say? The ending should be surprising but inevitable, right? And so every novel has to build to, I mean, it can't just be something that comes out of the blue. It has to build to it. So it's always about sort of like, how do we get there, to me, which I love.
Definitely. Actually, this book was partly inspired by Jazz by Toni Morrison, not in plot or anything, but like crafts. And one of the things I love about that book is she writes the ending on the first page. She's like, this girl died at this time and she was stabbed. And you want to read on anyways. You want to see how that happened.
Yes.
So that, I think I agree with you that it's not so much, the importance isn't so much the ending, but rather how we get there.
How do we get there? I know, couldn't Morrison, she could do that stuff, like stuff that make you sort of drop your jaw. Like, how do you do that? How do you write the ending at the beginning and people still keep on? Let's see. Are there any other questions as we wind down? Let's see here. I think I've asked. Any other questions? Okay, so then we are at the final question of the night, which is, what is next on the horizon for you? And I know this book just came out, and I just want to say, y'all, anytime anybody asks me this question, y'all know we always ask our authors this. It's like a nerve-wracking question, but somebody actually had a question about a potential series.
So Masquerade is a standalone, and I'm very firm about that. I always love when books, they're not completely resolved. I think they should want the reader wanting a little bit more. So I feel like where it ended is perfect for this story. But I am working on another book that is set in medieval West Africa. It's a completely different story, but it follows a woman who also kind of, goes to extremes to get what she wants. That's what I'll say about it.
I like it already. Yolanda, a member of our book club, says, not a question, but this book is in my top 5 all-time favorite books.
Oh, wow. Thank
Very
you.
well written. And I will tell you, like, I am telling everybody about somebody else's. Your writing is beautiful. I agree. I just want everybody. I don't want this book to, go undiscovered by, people. I want y'all to let 5 people know. Now, this is one of those books you can't loan out because it's too pretty. I'm not loaning.
You're never
I'm
going to
sorry.
get it back.
No, I would never get it back. And this is like, look at this. No, and then if they did give it back to me, they probably wouldn't take good care of it. But I do hope that y'all will tell people about it. Checking books out of the library is also a good thing. That helps to create chatter about a book. So however people can get their hands on it. But if you can, this is one to purchase in hardcover. Y'all know I don't say that every time. But this one, you want to have this one on your bookshelf in hardcover. Masquerade. Any final thoughts you want to share? Somebody says I'm going to recommend it to my other Facebook group. It was such a good read. Someone said, Yolanda, I agree. So you've got some huge fans here.
Thank you so much. This was so nice.
Thank you for joining us. Y'all, I'm going to leave this video up on my Instagram. So if you are catching this, tomorrow or the next day, please support Oyin. Tell people about the book, and let's all follow her on all of her social medias. I'm gonna link her on my social media. Let's follow her. Let's all be ready to pre-order the next time that second book comes out. We're gonna be ready for you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.